Thank you and good morning. It's great to be here in Mandurah. Before I talk about Barnabas Fund in a little while, I just want to draw your attention to China. Now, over the last 40 years or so, it looked as if the persecution and the situation for Christians in China was gradually getting better. But over the last, since the new government and the issues in China have changed dramatically, so much so that there is more and more control on Christians and on Christian churches. And there's been some movement earlier in the year. The Chinese government, the authorities, shut down a large church just recently. So much so that a number of Christian leaders in China have been very brave to put out a public statement to the government, but like a public statement, very much in the same way as the church in Germany did in the 30s, where they took a stand as to where they would be as to their position to what was happening. And so the church in China has been, the leaders have been very brave, so much so that that has come into the secular press, in The Guardian of all places, and they've done a report just a week or two ago, and the end of that statement says, "For the sake of the gospel, we are prepared to bear all losses, even the loss of freedom and even our lives." Now, I want you to let that sink in. One of the Christians who was interviewed by the Guardian, the newspaper, in the light of this, said, "We are scared, but we have Jesus." And that is something to really think about for us as Christians in the freedom we have. If life and freedom and our Christian experience is reduced to the point where we say, yes, we are scared about all that, but the only thing we have Jesus. Isn't that precious to think about that? A situation like in China is exactly the reason why Barnabas Fund exists, for the church and for our brothers and sisters who are, for whom the opposition and the persecution is like a daily issue. And so Barnabas Fund exists to support those people and those churches specifically. We have a mandate. We all have a mandate, but specifically Barnabas Fund, we've taken that on in Galatians 6 verse 10, that our mandate is specifically for the family of believers. And so that's why we exist. And so we work through local churches and local entities and local partners in areas like China, Vietnam, and the Middle East, obviously, Northern Africa, or Africa in general, places like Pakistan, and I'll just say something about Pakistan just in a minute. So we work through people like yourself, through Barnabas Fund, through local churches and local church leaders who have the expertise for the needs of local people. And so we draw from that expertise to fashion our projects. Very often we hear from the local church leaders what the needs are, and we then plug into those needs financially. Very often, a lot of countries now are suspicious of outside agencies. And so we stay in the shadows, as it were, and the actual legwork, the hands-on work, is being done by local people. That, of course, makes the actual ministry cheaper to run. We run on overheads of 12%, which is very low comparatively. So that means that your gift and the gifts of people, 88% of those gifts are actually doing the work. And in addition to that, if people choose a particular project that they have on their hearts, then we guarantee that 100% of that gift goes to that project. So there's quite a range of things that Barnabas Fund assists the persecuted church. One of them, for instance, as you can see, is like Christian workers and leadership training and all that. I mean, we are so blessed we can go to Koorong and buy any Bible we want. We can download any Bible we want, or any kind of material. Christian leaders don't have that. Very often, pastors have to work because their congregations are very poor. And so for pastors to have that kind of support and material and so on is very important. That's just one area. Victims of violence. Now, I don't know if you heard that in the secular press, but just yesterday I had an email about a church a bus in Egypt with Coptic believers on their way to a particular church were held up by gunmen. The 2nd of November, which is Friday, gunmen opened fire on the buses as they were driving to the monastery of St. Samuel the Confessor. 7 Christians were killed, but it's likely there will be more. It was a duplicate of an attack 12 months ago or 18 months ago. Exactly the same situation. I spoke with a Coptic pastor some time ago, and we talked about these issues that has just happened. And he said, Rudolf, for us that is our daily bread. What happens in Egypt? So there's one area where Barnabas Fund very often, within a day or two, can be informed about what the needs are. People having to go to hospital. Who pays for that? Very often we pay for that. People have to bury their loved ones. Who pays for that? Very often Barnabas Fund can step in and do that. Other one of victims of violence, you may have heard the case of Isaiah Bibi in Pakistan. Christian lady who's been caught up in the blasphemy issue and has been in prison most of the time on death row for about 9 years. She has been acquitted just last week after all those years. But the High Court, first of all, upheld the validity of the blasphemy laws. So the High Court didn't say that she shouldn't have been, the blasphemy laws stay in place. And so she's been acquitted on technicalities. Spare thought and prayer for the Christians in Pakistan who are now bearing the brunt of the anger of Islamists in Pakistan because of this issue. So even though we rejoice that Isaiah Bibi, has been acquitted, but in actual fact she is not allowed to leave Pakistan, which is another. But the oppression of Christians in Pakistan obviously continues. Convert care. Very often, now Pakistan is a prime example, but in other jurisdictions, in other countries, whether it be Islam or whether it be Hinduism, when people become Christians, they become especially vulnerable. If they are business people, they lose their business, they lose their families, and so on. Especially women and children are especially vulnerable. So these are just some of the areas that Barnabas Fund is working and helping. School place sponsorships. And again, we talk about Pakistan, but also Egypt, where Christian children, if they go to a state school, they are being persecuted because they are Christians. And then in the process, they are also being indoctrinated with Islam. So to have Christian families have the opportunity to send their children to Christian schools where they have an education in security is very important. I just want to highlight a number of specific things. You will have heard about the earthquake in Sulawesi. The church or the churches involved in that area and the Christians is actually one of our partner churches. So very, very quickly we've been able to channel money, funds through those churches, especially for Christians. Why do we do this? It is because in times of disaster, very often Christians suffer twice. They suffer because their homes are destroyed or whatever, as much as the population. But then they suffer because when aid comes in, very often that comes through hostile channels. And Christians, because they're Christians, they're at the back of the queue. In the same way, we are doing an appeal for the Kachin Christians. And you don't hear anything in the secular press very much about this, but whole communities of Christians in Burma have been displaced. Their communities have been burned down, and so that's a basic need project. Basic needs: shelter and food and water and so on. And this is a very accurate picture. The other project that I would just like to draw your attention to, in Bangladesh, the Santhal Christian community 2 years ago were chased from their villages because the government wanted to use that area to develop and to make money. And because they were just Christians, they really didn't, they didn't count. So 2 years ago, that community, the police moved in and chased them out, and their community was burned as they were leaving. So these people have lived in tents, and Barnabas Fund, through the local church, we've been able to, in a safe place, in a church compound, to build these units, which will house 50 families. So it's not very big. 50 families. The first of those have been built, and 50 families have moved in, and we have now moved on to building a second compound like that, just to build that Christians can live safely and with dignity. So what can we do? I would first of all, commend our church family in areas like that. And we've only touched the surface, really. Christian persecution of Christians. Christians are the largest, most persecuted people group in the world, and they still are, and it's still getting worse, even though you don't hear a lot. So, for us to take people into their hearts, that we start praying about it and being their advocate. This is my work specifically, to be an advocate for people who have no voice. You can be informed. We have a table there that we set up with material so that you can be informed. A newsletter, you can subscribe to the newsletter once every second month. Just last but not least, through the years, Barnabas Fund, by being exposed to what persecution really means, we have started to see in our culture, in our country, in our Western world, some of the characteristics of the persecution that we see overseas starting to happen here in our own country. We may not be put in prison or lose our lives, but some of these things. So Barnabas Fund, just earlier this year, we brought out a little booklet, and you're welcome to have those, free, which traces the freedom of religion in the English-speaking world over the last few hundred years, and then looks at some of the things that are happening in places like Canada and England and Australia that are undermining that freedom just gradually. And then also we have a petition which before the end of the year will go to the federal parliament, pleading for freedom of religion in our country as the federal parliament discusses the Rudolf inquiry. That is enough for me. Thank you.